Good morning and welcome to the sixth meeting of the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee in 2025. I've received apologies from David Torrance, MSP, and welcome Jackie Dunbar to the committee as substitute. And the first item is for Jackie Dunbar to declare any relevant interests.
Thank you, Convener. I have no relative interests.
Thank you. Our second item today is consideration of the National Care Service Scotland Bill at Stage 2. I welcome the Minister for Social Care, Mental Wellbeing and Sport, and I will briefly explain the procedure we will be following during today's proceedings for anyone watching. Members should have with them a copy of the bill, the marshalled list and the groupings. These documents are available on the bill webpage on the Scottish Parliament's website for anyone observing. I will call each amendment individually in the order of the marshalled list. The member who lodged the amendment should either move it or say not moved when it's called. If that member doesn't move it, any other member present may do so. The groupings of amendments set out the amendments in the order in which they will be debated. There will be one debate on each group of amendments. In each debate, I will call the member who lodged the first amendment in the group to speak to and move that amendment, and to speak to all the other amendments in the group. I will then call other members with amendments in the group to speak to but not move their amendments, and to speak to other amendments in the group if they wish. I will then call any other members who wish to speak in the debate. Members wishing to speak should indicate that by catching mine or the clerk's attention. I will then call the Minister if she has not already spoken in the debate. And finally, I will call the member who moved the first amendment in the group to wind up and to indicate whether he or she wishes to press the amendment or withdraw it. If the amendment is pressed, I will put the question on the amendment. If a member wishes to withdraw an amendment after it has been moved and debated, I will ask whether any member present objects. If there is an objection, I will immediately put the question on the amendment. Later amendments in a group are not debated again when they are reached. If they are moved, I will put the question on them straight away. If there is a division, only members are entitled to vote. Only committee members, rather, are entitled to vote. Voting is by a show of hands. It's important that members keep their hands raised clearly until the clerk has recorded their names. If there is a tie, I must exercise a casting vote. In normal circumstances, the committee is also required to formally consider and agree each section of the bill. However, in this case, since a number of amendments seek to leave out entire sections of the bill, a separate decision on those sections will not be required. Where a separate decision is needed, I will put the question at the appropriate point. So I call Amendment 1 in the name of the Minister, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. I would point out that if Amendment 96 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 15 because of a preemption. In addition, Amendments 40, 158 and 67 are direct alternatives. That is, they can all be moved and decided on. The text of whatever is the last agreed to is what will appear in the bill. Minister, to move Amendment 1 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you. As set out in my statement to Parliament on the 23rd of January, we remain committed to delivering our Scottish National Care Service. However, I have concluded that we must achieve this without legislating for structural reform at this time, and we must instead pursue a different means of delivering on our goals. The result of this decision is that Part 1 of the bill, as introduced, requires to be removed. This would be done by Amendments 1 to 39 in my name. The removal of Part 1 has the most significant impact on the establishment of care boards and the transfer of responsibility for community health, social work and social care services to the Scottish Ministers. However, strengthening national oversight and support for the system remains a priority. We are currently working to establish an advisory board for these services, which crucially will be informed by lived experience. There are still several areas of local reform that we intend to pursue through other means than by primary legislation. We will continue to give further consideration to the National Care Service principles. In addition, we will proceed with publishing a co-designed Charter of Rights and Responsibilities independent of the bill. A revised programme to improve complaint services will also be developed and delivered. Independent information, advice and advocacy is an area in which provision in the bill would still be helpful. Therefore, my amendment 15 would move section 13 into part 3 of the bill, and we'll discuss amendments to it in a later group. Or I should say we will discuss those amendments if Brian Whittle's Amendment 96 is not agreed to, because it would remove section 13 from the bill entirely. I urge members not to support it. Amendments 60 to 68 in my name are technical amendments to the remaining parts of the bill to reflect the removal of Part 1. There are competing amendments for how to change the bill's short title to reflect the removal of Part 1. It will come as no surprise to members that I would invite them to support Amendment 67 in my name over Amendment 40 from Alec Cole-Hamilton and Amendment 158 from Brian Whittle. Brian Whittle's proposed short title of social care and support would not be an accurate description of the bill, because it refers only to social care, whereas Part 2 of the bill is also about healthcare. Alec Cole-Hamilton's proposal of care and carers is not technically inaccurate, but places an emphasis on carers, which, although an important element of the bill, is not the only important element. I have therefore proposed care reform on the basis that it is a broader description. I move Amendment 1 in my name.
Thank you, Minister. Brian Whittle to speak to Amendment 96 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. Can I, first of all, place on record my sincere thanks to the legislation team for processing my and many other amendments lodged with them in such an unreasonably short time. Across this chamber, we all recognise the need for reform to our social care sector. We all know our current model isn't sustainable, and we all want to see the change necessary to give social care in Scotland a sustainable, secure future. But I question whether rubble of SNP's National Care Service Bill is the best foundation for a sustainable social care sector. Can I be clear? Many of the actions proposed in this bill are ones we would support, but to deliver them through this cut-and-shut legislation, through government amendments brought forward at the last minute, does them a disservice, and I believe risks storing up problems for the future. Indeed, given the Scottish Government's fondness for secondary legislation, I'm unsure why we actually have cross-party support. They don't intend to use this. My amendments give MSPs from all parties the opportunity to agree that legislation for serious social care reform should begin from a fresh sheet of paper, not a half-shredded National Care Service Bill. Should members support the amendments and send this bill back to the drawing board, the Scottish Conservatives are committed to working across this chamber on new, properly planned legislation. If members choose to reject my amendments and continue to build this house on sand, then we will seek to make the best of the legislation. But I don't recognise that this will produce the kind of legislation that social care deserves. And I hope MSPs will agree to scrap this bill and build something better. On 158, the bill, as it looks in February 2025, is very different from the objectives it set out to achieve. Its name needs to be reflective of its contents, which now represent much more technical and specific amendments rather than radical reform. In fact, it doesn't represent any kind of radical social care reform as outlined as required through either the Freely report or the Scottish Government's own ambitions for the National Care Service as it was. Scottish Care has been clear about the need to use the language of social care distinctively rather than often ambiguous terminology of care when detailing aspects of formal support planning and provision. The importance of this is increasingly recognised at government level and should be reflective in the bill's name, given the bill in this iteration focuses more specifically on elements of social care rather than wider changes. The Social Care and Support Scotland Act would represent a clearer, unambiguous approach to dealing with the bill, what the bill does and does not achieve. It does not take away from the need for urgent and radical social care reform to be progressed, but acknowledges that this bill is now premised on more functional changes to existing practices and is no longer the key driver for transformative approaches. And I move the amendments in my name.
Thank you, Mr Whittle. Alec Cole-Hamilton to speak to Amendment 40 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'm very pleased to be here today, and I'm pleased to speak to Amendment 40 in my name. This amendment seeks to rename the legislation, changing it from the National Care Service Bill to the Care and Carers Bill. As the committee will know, the Scottish Liberal Democrats stood against this bill in its original form from the very start and the principles that were attendant to it. We did so because it sought to centralise social care services and remove power from the communities and the care professionals who are best placed to exercise that power, both for the good of those who provide and those who receive care. I'm pleased that in the light of opposition from all other parties, the government has finally decided to change course and have abandoned the centralisation or the centralising ministerial takeover of social care. It is unfortunate, though, that it has taken 4 years and £30 million of taxpayers' money being wasted on this premise to get to this point. It's now only right that the legislation we're proceeding with is named in a way that reflects what it intends to do. Even in its original form, this legislation would not have created a national care service. Giving it a similar name to one of our most beloved national treasures in the National Health Service was quite a cynical attempt to make it appear to be something that it was not. The NHS answered a need from the rubble and poverty of war in which it was forged. This takeover of social care was not. The NHS offered care that was free at the point of delivery. Nothing about the National Care Service intended to do that. What is now needed is a bill that seeks to support those who work in the care sector and those who rely upon it. I note there are 2 other amendments which rightly seek to change the name of the bill, but I believe it would be appropriate to rename the legislation the Care and Carers Bill so that Parliament can send a clear message both to care workers and to care users and the legions of unpaid carers that they are what really matters. Thank you.
Sanders Gohani.
Thank you, Commissioner of Interest in Practising NHS GP. I think we need to be absolutely clear on the timeline that we have had here when it comes to this bill. Introduced initially by Humza Yousaf, this is 3.5 to 4 years later. We are £30 million worse off than we were at the start of this process, and we have lost the principles of the bill. We got to a stage where amendments were put in by the government, remember, after 4 years of having this bill, where we had 48 hours to digest the amendments and then to make our own decisions on what to do. I don't think that's a particularly acceptable timeline when you think of the amount of time and money that's been spent on it. And let's not forget the second iteration of this bill, with 200-odd amendments, which has completely been scrapped and we're not even talking about anymore. A farce would be generous when it comes to this bill. The Minister has spoken about this being reform. This is not reform. Reform within a social care sector would be doing things that actually make changes. This is not a reform to the sector. What we are seeing here is a bill where we are simply having an SNP government and a minister who is trying to save face. And that is why we're in this position, when actually what we have realised is, as we said all along, a lot of this, Anne's Law, Frank's Law, could have been done straight away. 4 years ago we could have done this, and people wouldn't have been waiting like they have been right now. And so this is completely unacceptable in a position that we are in, and the people of Scotland should rightly be very upset as to how we found ourselves. When it comes to the amendment, I would urge people to vote for Brian Whittle's amendment, because we do need to take real evidence for the bill. This is totally different to what we originally set out on. And so we need to go back, we need to take proper evidence, and we need to make sure we are doing the right thing and not just legislate for the sake of legislation. Thank you.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Convener. It is deeply regrettable that the Government has effectively gutted what was once a very ambitious legislative item in the name of the National Care Service Scotland Bill, and indeed the Government's proposed renaming of it as the Care Reform Scotland Act of 2025 does present a misnomer in my belief. Therefore, we cannot support the Government's proposed change to the legislative title of the bill. However, would be minded to support the proposed name change in the name of Mr Cole Hamilton to the Care and Carers Act. I feel it's a more appropriate reflection of the reduced horizons of the government in terms of ambition in this legislation, and fundamentally the goal here in this regard with the fact that the aspects that actually create the National Care Service Bill have been removed, therefore must be moving to preserve fair work, collective bargaining, Anne's Law and rights to respite and ethical commissioning. I think in that respect the scope of the bill would more readily reflect the title of the name Care and Carers Act than Care Reform, given the curtailed nature of any fundamental reforms in the bill. Thank you.
Minister, to wind up.
Thank you, Convener. I don't agree with Brian Whittle and Sandesh Gulhani's proposal to scrap the legislation, and I note their in principle support for many of the amendments that we've put forward to reform health and social care, and I urge them, therefore, to vote for them in this bill. As mentioned with regard to Mr Cole Hamilton's name proposal, I would ask members to support the name Care Reform that I am proposing on the basis that is a broader description.
Thank you, Minister. The question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. I call Amendment 2 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I call Amendment 3 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I call Amendment 4 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Call Amendment 5 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Excuse me. Call Amendment 6 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Call Amendment 7 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Call Amendment 8 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 8 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Call Amendment 9 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Call Amendment 10 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 10 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Call Amendment 11 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Call Amendment 12 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 12 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Call Amendment 13 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 13 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Call Amendment 14 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 14 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Call Amendment 91 in the name of Brian Whittle, grouped with Amendments 69, 41, 70, 92, 93, 94 and 95. I would point out that if Amendment 41 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 70 because of a preemption. Brian Whittle, to move Amendment 91 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. Moved. The committee at stage one recommended that in an effort to strengthen these provisions in the current bill, the committee recommends that the Scottish Government refers to the corresponding provisions of Social Security Scotland Act 2018 as a potential template for independent advocacy provisions of the bill, in particular the right to advocacy, the definition of advocacy services and the development of advocacy services standard provided by that Act. I think this is because stakeholders were adamant that independent advocacy should be on the face of the bill to enhance parliamentary scrutiny and uphold those rights to access of independent advocacy. Now, I realise that 94 and 95 amendments are reasonably similar, and I would be open to working with the colleagues at stage 3 in developing a tighter definition of advocacy to ensure it is fully independent, not only from ministers, but also independent financially and structurally from those organisations delivering the care.
Gillian Mackay to speak to Amendment 69 and other amendments in the group.
Thanks, Convener. My amendments 69, 70 and 94 are designed to provide a clear definition of independent advocacy services to avoid ambiguity in how the legislation is applied. 94 in particular was developed with the Scottish Independent Advocacy Alliance in terms of a definition. It ensures that advocacy is genuine. Other amendments ensure that advocacy is genuinely independent, as well as it applying to all care services. But despite best efforts, there are still people who will need advice, who will need advocacy to access services. I appreciate the Minister's Amendment 41 preempts my Amendment 70. I still believe that advocacy needs to cover all services, not just those that are in the public realm. And I hope that if the Minister's Amendment passes, we can have a look at how we achieve the spirit of Amendment 70 at stage 3. Truly independent advocacy is essential to build trust. People must feel confident that their advocates are acting in their best interests, as well as being able to access advice and information. The definition aligns with best practice and ensures consistency across the social care system.
Thank you, Ms Mackay. Minister to speak to Amendment 41 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you very much. As I said in the debate on the last group, I continue to think there would be value in having the bill make provision about independent information, advice and advocacy, and therefore my Amendment 15 would move Section 13 into Part 3 of the bill. The amendments in this group are about the substance of Section 13. For this group, I'm asking the committee to support my amendments 41 and 69 and not to support amendments 91, 69, 70, 92, 93, 94 and 95. However, there are some areas where I would like to work with members to look at revising these amendments ahead of stage 3. On 91, 92 and 95, which deal with a right to independent advocacy, I am committed to enhancing independent advocacy services as a mechanism for empowering people to have their voices heard and participate fully in decisions about their care. However, members will be aware that such a right would require significant expansion of capacity for providers of advocacy support to ensure that they could respond to such advocacy support. That would take time to work through and would see a significant cost to the public purse that must be considered carefully. Members are also aware of my commitment to listening to the voice of people with lived and living experience through co-design. Recent analysis of co-design work on independent advocacy has highlighted various issues, and my officials will bring me options on as to how we can address these going forwards. So some of these solutions may require legislative change using regulations making powers this government has brought forward in this bill, and others may not. Until I've decided which options to take forward, I will look to maintain the provisions as they are and therefore ask members not to support amendments 91, 92 and 95. I offer my support for Amendment 69 as part of my commitment to enhancing independent advocacy services. A regulation-making power allows us to implement the results from co-design and engagement with stakeholders. This way, we can use the insights gathered through co-design and engagements with stakeholders to ensure the legislation supports improvements to the provision of independent advocacy in Scotland. Amendment 41 adds to the existing drafting to ensure that, as well as the possibility of independent advocacy connected to public social care services being provided for in secondary legislation in future, independent advice and independent information can also be provided for in that way. Stakeholders asked us to do this in stage 1 of the bill, and I'm happy to make this change. This means we can gain from the insights of both professional stakeholders and those with lived and living experience of accessing social care support services, and allows us to keep broader options going forward. The amendment also updates the reference to services which the National Care Service provides in this section with a reference to public social care services, which is defined with reference to the enactments listed in the Schedule to the Public Bodies Joint Working Scotland Act 2014. I trust members will be pleased with my response to a request from Stage 1 and support Amendment 41. My amendment preempts Amendment 70, and I believe it achieves what the member was intending with their amendment to clarify the scope of this provision in light of the structure of the National Care Service going forward. If that's not the case, I'm very happy to work with the member going forward. On Amendment 93, I'm sympathetic to what the member is trying to achieve with regards to advocacy service standards. I also note that there are similar provisions within Amendments 92 and 95. We're all committed to ensuring the delivery of high-quality, independent advocacy. However, I do have some concerns with these specific amendments and the impact it could have on independent advocacy providers. In particular, Amendment 93 appears to apply to all advocacy services and not just those in relation to social care services, and I'm not sure that that's the member's intention. Therefore, I would ask that the member doesn't press his amendment. Instead, I would welcome the opportunity to work with the members who raised this issue to further consider advocacy service standards ahead of Stage 3. On Amendment 94, I appreciate what the member is trying to achieve, and again, no aspects of this are also present in 95. The importance of a clear definition of independent advocacy has come through very strongly in our co-design work and engagement with stakeholders. But we've also heard that definitions for independent advocacy can be inconsistent, and that this can limit awareness and understanding of independent advocacy services, making it harder for people to access them. Therefore, I would ask that members do not press Amendments 94 and 95 and instead work with me to bring back an amendment for a definition for independent advocacy for Stage 3 once we have had more time to fully consider our options.
Thank you, Minister. Paul Sweeney to speak to Amendment 92 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. Members of the committee, I beg to move that Amendment 92 and Amendment 95 in my name be considered by the committee as improvement to the legislation. The amendment in 92 adds to Section 13 a requirement that any regulations under subsection 1 must provide for a right to independent advocacy, that the services are available to those who need them, and defines what advocacy services should be applied. By voting for this amendment, we add clarity to the regulations that Scottish ministers should create so as to best give voice to those who need it when working with the provisions of social care. And indeed, Amendment 95 in my name intends to replace Section 13 with a more holistic definition of independent advocacy that guarantees the Scottish Minister's duty to ensure that it is available to those who have the right to do so. It is important that this is not allowed to stay as simply an optional extra for Scottish Ministers to decide through delegated powers, but instead that independent advocacy is available on the face of the bill for those who need it, including individuals who, if owing to disability, require help to engage effectively with the processes of determining their entitlement to and delivery of social care service. I do note that the Minister has indicated she is not minded to support these amendments at this stage. However, in the spirit of goodwill that she indicated, I am happy to work with the Minister on better defining the amendments, and hopefully we can reach a means of compromise at future stages.
Joe Fitzpatrick.
Thanks very much, Convener. I think this is a very important part of the bill. I'm really pleased to hear what the Minister is saying. It's clear that there's political consensus around the table in support of independent advocacy. That's a good thing. So I hope, and particularly after hearing what Mr Sweeney said just now, that is the way the committee will be able to go, passing Amendment 69-41, and then members discussing those particular issues to see if we can get consensus to make sure the general feeling around the table is taken forward at Stage 3 in a way that actually works. So thank members and the Minister for the engagement, and particularly that listening to the living and lived experience.
Brian Whittle to wind up. Press to withdraw the amendment.
Thank you, Convener. I think I should point out here that this amendments I put forward here are a reflection of a committee recommendations at stage 1. And in terms of the lived experience, I should say to the Minister that I spoke with the Scottish Independent Advocacy Alliance to make sure that the wording in which I put this forward, this amendment forward, fits with what they would want here. I am minded to press, although I would say that, as I said at the start, I am perfectly prepared to work with other members to tighten the definition of advocacy to ensure that it's fully independent. I would move the amendments.
Thank you, Mr Whittle. The question is that Amendment 91 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Committee's not agreed, therefore there will be a vote. Right, so we will have a division with a show of hands. Those in favour of Amendment 91, please indicate. Okay. Those against? Abstentions? So the result of the votes are there were 4 members for the amendment, 5 against and 1 abstention. Therefore, the amendment is not agreed. Call Amendment 69 in the name of Gillian Mackay, already debated with Amendment 91. Gillian Mackay to move.
Move, please, Convener.
The question is that Amendment 69 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 41 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 91. I remind members that if Amendment 41 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 70 due to preemption. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 41 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. So I call Amendment 92 in the name of Paul Sweeney, already debated with Amendment 91. Paul Sweeney to move or not move?
Not move, Convener.
Thank you. Call Amendment 93 in the name of Brian Whittle, already debated with Amendment 91. Brian Whittle to move.
Move.
The question is that Amendment 93 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Okay, committee is not in agreement and therefore we will move to a division. Those in favour of Amendment 93, please indicate. Those against? Are there any abstentions? No. So those committee members for Amendment 93 were 5, those against were 5. As there is a tie, I must exercise a casting vote, and my casting vote is against the amendment. And so the amendment is disagreed to, Amendment 93. I call Amendment 94 in the name of Gillian Mackay, already debated with Amendment 91. Gillian Mackay to move.
In the spirit of the offer from the Minister to work on a definition ahead of stage 3, I'll not move. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. I call Amendment 95 in the name of Paul Sweeney, already debated with Amendment 91. Paul Sweeney to move or not move?
Not move, Convener.
Thank you. I call Amendment 96 in the name of Brian Whittle, already debated with Amendment 1. I remind members that if Amendment 96 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 15 due to preemption. Brian Whittle to move or not move?
Moved, please.
The question is that Amendment 96 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Committee is not agreed, therefore there will be a division. Those for Amendment 96, please indicate. Those against? Any abstentions? The division on Amendment 96, there were 2 votes for and there were 8 votes against. Therefore, Amendment 96 is not agreed to. The question is that Section 13 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I call Amendment 15 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 15 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 97 in the name of Gillian Mackay, grouped with Amendments 71, 92, 72 and 99. Gillian Mackay to move Amendment 97 and to speak to all amendments in the group.
Thanks, Convener. And whilst I welcome the Scottish Government's intention to seek to improve the complaints process, I think there are still things that we could make better. It's important to make the system as smooth as possible, and unpaid carers have said the current system lacks both trust and transparency and often leaves them with issues unresolved. To bring about a trusted complaints procedure, it's clear that a process should be developed to enable complaints to be assessed against the principles of the bill. My amendments strengthen the complaint system by ensuring complaints are assessed against key principles as follows: realisation of human rights, enabling people to thrive and fulfil their potential, enabling communities to flourish and prosper. It also introduces guidance for complaints related to social care resource allocation and eligibility assessments, 2 very contentious issues in the sector. On the specific amendments themselves, not entirely sure if 97 is directed at the correct entity in terms of referring to local authorities. If there are any issues with that the Minister flags, I'm happy to work with coming up with a more appropriate definition for that ahead of stage 3. These have been worked on with carers organisations, so I hope other members can support them.
Minister?
Thank you. Amendments 16 and 17 in my name, which have already been debated in the first group, would have the effect of removing the complaints provision section 14 and 15 from the bill. I am of the view that the complaint service provided for by section 14 and the associated regulation making power at section 15 can no longer be included without the entirety of part 1 of the bill. A new NCS complaints service will not make sense in isolation. Let me be clear, however, that I am absolutely committed to improving the complaints processes. The independent review of adult social care was clear that when things do not work well for people and their rights have not been met, they must have rapid recourse to an effective complaint system and to redress, and that the NCS which that review proposed should prioritise an improved complaints process. Over 200 people with lived experience of receiving, accessing or delivering care have been involved in co-design and engagement so far to consider findings from existing evidence and to identify key priorities for improvements to the complaints processes. This will enable us to identify and drive forward the improvements required to ensure a rights-based approach for complaints. If this committee supports removal of Part 1 of the bill, we will continue to work closely with people accessing and delivering care and our stakeholders in order to identify improvements to be taken forward. If sections 14 and 15 were to remain in the bill, I cannot support amendments 97, 71, 98, 72 and 99, all of which relate to complaints. Amendment 97 seeks to limit the scope of complaints that could be dealt with by the Complaints Service that's required under Section 14 of the bill to only those care services provided by local authorities. That would mean the Complaints Service would not be able to receive complaints in all circumstances, for example, where someone is accessing social care services via self-directed support options 1 and 2. I believe it's vital we do not limit the Complaints Service in this way, and we ensure that all users of social care services are able to utilise the new Complaints Service. Turning to Amendment 71, which seeks to make clear that the person to be allocated the complaint is not only appropriate as currently required by Section 14(3), but is also the person overseeing its resolution. While this amendment may be seeking to provide clarity, its effect is to confuse the position on who complaints are passed to. The person who oversees the resolution of complaints may not be the person best placed to address that complaint. This is particularly true when the role of oversight bodies such as the Care Inspectorate and SPSO is taken into account. I therefore encourage members not to support the Amendment 71. Amendment 72 seeks to define who may make a complaint to the NCS Complaints Service. However, unintentionally setting this out on the face of the bill risks interfering with existing established legal procedures. The Model Complaints Handling Procedure for handling public body social care complaints set by the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman already defines who can submit a complaint, and while this is deliberately broad-ranging, it is defined enough to only allow relevant complaints. This includes relatives or representatives of people who use services, as well as those who come into contact with or are affected by services. This amendment would also limit the scope to use the associated regulation-making power at Section 15 in the future. It's for these reasons that I ask for this amendment also not to be supported. Amendment 98 seeks to establish that a relevant complaint is about a social service as defined by Section 46 of the Public Services Reform Scotland Act 2010. This narrows the present wording to remove reference to the NCS rather than extend it. I understand the intent of this amendment, however, I believe it's vital we do not limit the scope of services in this way to ensure that all users of social care across the sector, for example, both public and private provision, and those services where integration is key, for example, community health and prison social care, are able to utilise the new complaint service and associated complaints-related regulations where appropriate. I therefore encourage members not to support Amendment 98. Turning to Amendment 99, which provides examples of regulations in relation to what complaints handling may cover. This includes assessing complaints against a set of principles and providing guidance on handling complaints made in relation to the allocation of resources and assessment of eligibility and timescales. While I welcome and will further consider the examples proposed, the regulation-making power of Section 15 is subject to the outcomes of co-design that enable us to develop and strengthen a consistent complaints system and associated redress. I do not wish to undermine or preempt the outcomes of co-design by including examples on the face of the bill. I therefore invite members not to support Amendment 99.
Thank you, Minister. Gillian Mackay to wind up and withdraw Amendment 97.
Thanks, Convener. I said at the outset I wasn't entirely sure that 97 was directed at the correct bodies, and appreciate what the Minister has said about 97 in particular. 99 was the other one that I did, 72 and 99 were the other two I wanted to respond to specifically in winding up. 72 in particular was from carers to make sure that it wasn't just a person receiving care that could complain, and they did want that clarity on the face of the bill. On 99, again, I appreciate not wanting to preempt what the co-design process looks like, but I would hope that all of these things would be taken into consideration in developing a complaints process anyway. So in my mind, it doesn't completely preempt what could be done at co-design, but I will not move 97.
Thank you, Ms Mackay.
It's a withdrawal.
So Gillian Mackay seeks to withdraw Amendment 97. Does any member object to the amendment being withdrawn? No, no member objects. Thank you. I call Amendment 71 in the name of Gillian Mackay, already debated with Amendment 97. Gillian Mackay, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 71 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Committee is not agreed, therefore there will be a division. Those members in favour of Amendment 71, can they please indicate? Those against? Any abstentions? Three members voted in favour of Amendment 71, 7 against. Therefore, Amendment 71 is not agreed to. I call Amendment 16 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 16 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I call Amendment 98 in the name of Gillian Mackay, already debated with Amendment 97. Gillian Mackay, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 98 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Committee is not agreed, therefore there will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 98, can they please indicate? Those against? Any abstentions? Three members voted in favour of Amendment 98. 7 members voted against. There were no abstentions, therefore the amendment is disagreed to. The question is that Amendment 98 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Oh, we just did that one. Apologies. I've marked my papers in the wrong place. I call Amendment 72 in the name of Gillian Mackay, already debated with Amendment 97. Gillian Mackay, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 99 in the name of Gillian Mackay, already debated with Amendment 97. Gillian Mackay, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 99 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Committee is not in agreement. There will be a division. Those members in favour of Amendment 99, can they please indicate? Those against? Any abstentions? Three members voted in favour of Amendment 99, 7 voted against. There were no abstentions, therefore Amendment 99 is disagreed to. Call Amendment 17 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Move.
The question is that Amendment 17 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 18 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 18 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Call Amendment 19 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 19 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 20 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 20 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 21 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 21 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Call Amendment 22 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 22 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Call Amendment 23 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 23 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Call Amendment 24 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 24 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Call Amendment 25 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 25 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
I call Amendment 26 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 26 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
I call Amendment 27 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 27 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Call Amendment 28 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 28 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
I call Amendment 29 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 29 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Call Amendment 30 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 30 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
I call Amendment 31 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 30 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? 31, sorry. 31 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
I call Amendment 32 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 32 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Call Amendment 33 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 33 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Call Amendment 34 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 34 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Call Amendment 35 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 35 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Call Amendment 36 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 36 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 37 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 37 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Call Amendment 38 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 38 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
I call Amendment 39 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 39 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 100 in the name of Jackie Bailey, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. Jackie Bailey to move Amendment 100 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Let me thank you, Convener, and of course the committee for the opportunity to attend your meeting and to speak to the amendments in this group. I will cover all 9 of my amendments and add a very brief word about the amendments in the name of Carol Mochan. Across our country, I believe there is actually consensus that our NHS is nothing without its staff. But I think this applies too to the social care sector, and indeed many of the problems in social care, from a lack of care packages to unpaid carers not receiving the right support, emanates from the failure, I believe, to properly value staff and to promote fair work. These amendments as such seek to build on the work of the Feely Review and embed fair work, human rights and ethical procurement into this bill. Now, whilst the Scottish Government's National Care Service is no more, and we've seen the removal of Part 1, I do believe we must ensure that this revised bill addresses fair work, addresses ethical commissioning and addresses procurement standards, which are core principles regarding the treatment of those receiving care and those providing that care. I've always argued that we need to change thinking in social care, but it's more about culture than it is about structures. And there is broad consensus, I believe, on this. So I want to salvage something positive from the wreckage of the National Care Service proposals, and these amendments start to give ministers, and through them, the proposed advisory board, that opportunity to address culture. Let me address the amendments in turn. Amendment 100 would create a new part to the bill. This amendment sets out the founding principles for fair work and human rights in Scotland's social care sector. The fair work, equality and human rights principles and duties as set out in Amendment 101 are not new. They shouldn't therefore be contentious. Amendments 100 and 101 are about creating a rights-respecting culture within the social care sector, something I know that we all support, and whether it's the public, private or not-for-profit providers. I'm keen to see more done to tackle those providers who are perhaps engaged in tax avoidance schemes, for example, rather than providing good quality social care as their first priority. Amendment 101, which I've already mentioned, makes reference to a strategic plan for social care services, which I will address in a later grouping. But in essence, this amendment creates a duty on Scottish ministers and other relevant authorities to implement social care services based on the founding principles and the strategic plan. Turning to ethical commissioning, Amendment 102 adds a requirement for the Scottish Government to prepare and publish a code of practice on ethical commissioning with appropriate consultation with service users, carers, providers and trade unions. This code of practice should be reviewed at least once during every 3-year period, informing the Scottish Parliament of the outcome. It is, I believe, appropriate to set out high-level intention in the bill and allow the collaboration and consultation with stakeholders to ensure that we get the detail right. Amendment 103 sets out a requirement for both the Scottish Government and public authorities to have regard to both this code of practice and the national standards for community engagement or other guidance on community engagement in designing, commissioning, delivering and reviewing services provided by the social care sector. Amendment 104 on ethical procurement is important and something I feel was actually missing from the original bill when it was introduced. In short, it requires the Scottish Government, by regulation, to provide for arrangements for the ethical procurement of social care services, something that they have said that they want to do. I appreciate that there is a lot in this amendment, but it's important in ensuring that the founding principles of services provided in Scotland's social care sector are actually met. It's important to have this on the face of the bill, and it's right, in my view, to leave the detail of the arrangements for secondary legislation. Amendment 105 requires contracting authorities to insert conditions related to performance to ensure that they comply with legal obligations that already exist within their contracts or framework agreements. Amendment 106 relates to collective bargaining, and I'm aware of concerns by some of the supposed impact this amendment will have regarding current negotiations between the Scottish Government, trade unions and employers in Scotland on agreeing a constitution for sectoral bargaining. Let me say, I'm genuinely pleased this work is happening, but to be fair, this is something that has been talked about for a very long time and has yet to materialise. So I therefore believe that the text of this bill should commit to collective bargaining arrangements. If the work of the Scottish Government and other stakeholders comes to fruition before the end of the passage of the bill, that would be most welcome and fits with the intention of this amendment. Finally, Amendment 114 concerns definitions used above, and Amendment 149 provides the power to make regulations regarding ethical procurement, which are subject to affirmative procedure. In closing, Convener, on Amendment 107, 108, 109, 110, 111, 112 and 113, in the name of Carol Mochan, I would urge support because this suite of amendments is designed to strengthen Fair Work principles on the face of the bill and embed human rights. So on that basis, I would urge all members to vote for the amendments in my name and those in Carol Mochan's name too. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Jackie Bailey. Can I ask you to move Amendment 100?
I move Amendment 100.
Thank you. Carol Mochan to speak to Amendment 107 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Convener. Can I start by thanking my colleague Jackie Bailey for moving her Amendment 100 and speaking to the other amendments in the group. And I do hope members will support the amendments. And I want to just particularly agree with the contribution on sectoral collective bargaining. It's been an important part of discussions, I know, with the Minister and others, but it's important that we do get this on the face of the bill. I am happy to speak to the amendments lodged in my name. The amendments seek to strengthen Fair Work principles on the face of the bill and embedded human rights. Amendment 107 seeks to ensure international workers employed in social care shall enjoy all the rights and benefits of UK status, the social care sectors and Fair Work in care. It requires Scottish ministers to create a Fair Work Charter for internationally recruited workers, along with statutory guidance on the application code of practice on ethical commissioning and regulation on ethical procurement to the delivery of fair work for internationally recruited workers. Amendment 108 places a duty on Scottish ministers to prepare and publish guidance on continuous improvement in the arrangements for fair work in the social care sector. The guidance would apply to all relevant public authorities and contracted providers, and the guidance would be subject to review each 3-year period, with revised guidance either being issued or a statement being laid before Parliament setting out that as a revision is needed, is not needed. Amendment 109 creates standardised acts and omissions of a contracted provider that constitutes a reportable breach of contract. In relation to fair work standards to be reported against, its intent is also to provide for remedies for contract terminations to manage the breaches, including creating a standard approach for managing and reporting and publishing these breaches. Whilst I appreciate Amendment 107 may be addressed elsewhere in legislation, I believe the amendments strengthen fair work principles on the face of the bill, and I'm interested to hear the Ministers respond to this. Amendment 110 seeks to ensure contracted providers comply with the labour relations requirements referred to in Amendment 105. It also makes the victimisation of social care workers on the grounds of trade union membership or trade union activity a breach of Amendments 100 and 101 on the founding principles and social care duties laid down by Jackie Bailey. The purpose of Amendment 111 is to maximise the realisation of human rights for service users and workers in the social care sector by providing regulation, making powers and duty to make regulation to achieve this purpose. The amendment requires that such regulations include provision covering financial transparency, control over profit, control over tax avoidance, sanctions for tax evasion, expansion of public and not-for-profit social care services, and establishment or designation of a care finance regulator. Human rights should be embedded within the bill, and that this amendment would strengthen the bill in this regard significantly. Amendment 112 and Amendment 113 creates provision around monitoring and reporting on fair work. Amendment 112 creates a common standard of fair work indicators with monitoring and reporting of those indicators to enforce fair work standards. Lastly, Amendment 113 would place a duty on the Scottish Ministers to publish an annual report on fair work in care in Scotland, and I would urge members to support those amendments. Thank you.
Thank you. Brian Whittle to speak to Amendment 146 and other amendments in the group.
Right. Thank you, Convener. This amendment really is from a recommendation from the Committee at Stage 1 report, which states that irrespective of the model of accountability, the Committee believes proposals for the creation of a National Care Service need to be accompanied by a reinforced role for the Scottish Parliament in undertaking regular structured scrutiny of its implementation and the extent to which it's achieving its defined objectives. To support this reinforced scrutiny role, the committee called for the bill to include provisions enabling the Scottish Government to keep Scottish Parliament regularly updated on its operations of the National Care Service, including in particular an assessment of the extent to which this is contributing to improve outcomes for those in receipt of that social care. I think I have to say there's real concerns around Section 41, despite its intention from the stakeholders. I think this amendment seeks to provide assurances to those stakeholders that the guidelines are reviewed. I think this will help Parliament understand the impact of ethical commissioning and any interactions with other procurement contracts, if any.
Thank you, Mr Whittle. Gillian Mackay.
Thanks, Convener. I just wanted to come in very briefly on this group as a whole and absolutely support what Carol Mockin and Jackie Bailey have already said. But I hope maybe in summing up, Jackie Bailey could cover what the totality of the impact of this is for local authorities as well. So obviously it's not always Scottish Government that are the ones that are doing the procuring in the first place. And throughout this bill process, one of the concerns that we've had is that autonomy for local authorities as well. So I hope Jackie Bailey might be able to address that those considerations in our summing up.
Thank you. Minister.
Convener, I'm delighted to see that there's widespread support for the principle of fair work, ethical commissioning and ethical procurement in Scotland. On Amendment 100 put forward by Jackie Bailey, I'm not against the use of principles in legislation. The Government included principles in Part 1 of the Bill for the National Care Service, but I am unclear on the benefit of including these principles in legislation and what consequences they would have in the wider social care system. In particular, and unlike the principles in Section 1 of the Bill, they do not seem focused on those people receiving care and support. I'll always agree that Scotland's social care sector will benefit from being an exemplar of fair work. Work is already ongoing to develop sectoral bargaining with our partners in the social care sector, and we are also working with the UK Government on changes to the UK Employment Rights Bill in this area. The Scottish Government is providing funding to deliver the real living wage to social care workers, delivering direct care and commissioned services. This was £230 million this financial year and will be £125 million next year, subject to the budget being agreed. Further, an effective voice framework is also currently being piloted and will be evaluated over the summer before being implemented on a national basis. So whilst I agree in the ethos of people first, this principle of people before profit, while commendable, is likely not implementable, and it could have unforeseen consequences. The people of Scotland rely on a variety of services delivered by a multitude of different organisations, including the third and independent and public sector, and to prevent social care provision based on profit making would significantly risk the delivery of the support and services our people need. On tax avoidance, the Scottish Government recognises that a more robust and fair system of taxation could potentially enhance the commitment to realising the human rights of service users and workers by increasing the available resources. I'm not sure that this principle will achieve the aims the member wants, and it could have other unintended consequences with other legislation, including procurement legislation. There may be a place for principles in legislation, and we can have a further discussion on what those could be. I believe they must improve the experience of those being cared for and supported in Scotland. I am not convinced that the current set of principles in this amendment do that, so I would invite the member not to press the amendment, and if pressed, I would ask the committee not to support the amendment. I do not support Amendment 101 put forward by Jackie Bailey relating to the new social care sector duties. I understand that the intention of this amendment is to create a requirement for ministers to act in accordance with the founding principles set out in Amendment 100 and in accordance with the National Strategic Plan for Social Care Services set out in Amendment 115. Whilst I agree that it would be helpful for there to be clarity about our aims and objectives for delivery of social work and social care services, the problem with this amendment is that it creates new statutory duties for ministers in respect of social care services. That goes against the agreement that has been reached that local government will retain responsibility for these services. As local government will retain responsibility for delivery of social work and social care services, it is no longer appropriate for ministers to have new duties in respect of them, even very broad duties as proposed in this amendment. It could make it less, not more clear, who is responsible for improving services for people, which is a key demand of people with lived and living experience. It could create a situation where ministers had to take on ultimate responsibility for delivery as a last resort, and I do not think this is wanted. I'd be happy to work with the member on alternative wording if this is wanted, although I must stress that a new duty for ministers is not needed anymore. If we were to have an amendment along these lines, I would want to ensure that we strengthen and build on the integration of health and social care. I would therefore invite the member not to press the amendment, but if pressed, I would ask the committee not to support it. On Amendment 102 put forward by Jackie Bailey, I recognise the intention, which is to bring a consistent approach to commissioning. I do not believe this amendment is necessarily the best way to achieve the improvement that we all seek. Ministers are not responsible for the commissioning of social care, and this amendment misses out those who are. I know there is an implementation gap between the intent of the commissioning of social care and what is ultimately delivered. A working group in partnership with COSLA, and which includes representation from social care providers, commissioners and people with lived experience, is developing principles for ethical commissioning and guidance which all commissioners can use. This work is about a focus on the outcomes for people who use social care and ensuring their voice is heard during the commissioning process. Given the positive steps already being taken in relation to ethical commissioning, I do not consider further provision in the form of this amendment is necessary, but I would be happy to work with the member on an appropriate amendment for stage 3. I would therefore invite the member not to press the amendment, but if pressed, I would ask the committee not to support it. On Amendment 103, put forward by Jackie Bailey, the purpose of this amendment is to place a duty on Scottish ministers and relevant public authorities in relation to the Code of Practice proposed in the previous amendment, and they have due regard to it in relation to the design, commissioning, delivery and review of social care services. The work I mentioned already underway on ethical commissioning principles and guidance will assist in closing the implementation gap between commissioning intent and what's delivered in practice. However, as with Amendment 102, I'd be happy to work with the member on an appropriate amendment for stage 3. So again, I would invite the member not to press the amendment, but if pressed, I would ask the committee not to support it. On Amendment 104 put forward by Jackie Bailey, I'm committed to delivering ethical procurement and I'm confident we already have the legislative powers to deliver this. Whilst I sympathise with what this amendment is trying to achieve, this amendment duplicates existing procurement regulations. Procurement legislation and policy, including the Sustainable Procurement Duty, already provide details on how procurement should be carried out, including key considerations for public sector bodies. Scottish ministers are required to publish guidance specific to health and social care, which contracting authorities must have due regard to. It is through this statutory guidance that we will embed ethical procurement practices. Therefore, the Government's position is to oppose Amendment 104. It is unnecessary. It risks further complicating the procurement landscape for people, providers and public sector bodies. So I would ask members not to support this amendment. On Amendment 105, it's vital that care service providers meet all their legal obligations, no matter how they are funded. The proposed amendment is substantially a duplication of the requirements set in Regulation 19 of the Public Contracts Scotland Regulation 2015. Therefore, it will have no practical effect. Amendment 105, as drafted, would also put requirements on public sector bodies when procuring a wide range of services. It's not limited to community health and social care, which is the focus of this bill, and the reference to social care providers does not achieve that. So again, I would invite the member not to press the amendment, but if pressed, I would ask the committee not to support it. On Amendment 106, put forward by Jackie Bailey, I support the establishment of sectoral bargaining arrangements for the social care workforce. However, I cannot support these amendments. The limitation of legislative competence in relation to employment law mean the Scottish Parliament cannot establish statutory requirements for participation in sectoral bargaining. We've only had a short time to consider the amendment, but we have serious concerns that this amendment is out with the legislative competence of the Parliament. This Government has not stood still on this important element of Fair Work. The Fair Work in Scotland group have been working to develop a voluntary sectoral bargaining model which provides a mechanism to determine pay terms and conditions on a voluntary participation basis. The Scottish Government is also engaging with the UK Government on the Employment Rights Bill. We hope the bill can create a legislative basis for Scottish National Social Care negotiating body and fair pay agreements in Scotland. So again, I would invite the member not to press the amendment, but if pressed, I would ask the committee not to support it. On Amendment 107, put forward by Carol Mochan, I am delighted to see the interest in international recruitment. However, the proposed amendment would add an additional burden on social care and would potentially not improve the situation in Scotland for international workers. We already demonstrate our commitment to ethical recruitment through our existing code of practice for the international recruitment of health and social care personnel in Scotland. In a similar vein to Fair Work and Employment Powers, UK Government continues to resist calls for responsibility for immigration policy as far as it affects Scotland to be passed to Scottish ministers. And without responsibility for immigration policy, we continue to press the Home Office for robust and regular data about international workers and their visas. We will continue to do what we can within the current competence of the Scottish Parliament, and policy work is underway in this sector to raise awareness, to support displaced visa holders and to look at improvement and system change. However, as this is an important issue and I agree with the spirit of the amendment, I am happy to look at this issue further and consider if there are improvements that could be made that need legislation before stage 3. So again, I would invite the member not to press the amendment, but if pressed, I would ask the committee not to support it. On Amendment 108, put forward by Carol Mochan, the Scottish Government already publishes Fair Work First guidance that public bodies and other public sector partners should give due regard to. Therefore, this amendment is not necessary. Again, I would invite the member not to press the amendment, and if pressed, I would ask the committee not to support it. On Amendment 109, put forward by Carol Mochan, the intent of Amendment 109 is unclear. The amendment provides a regulation-making duty for ministers to specify acts and omissions of a contracted provider that constitute a reportable breach of contract in relation to Fair Work standards. This amendment would result in information being gathered with no practical action enabled resulting from the information. It is therefore challenging to see how and where this would exert real change for care workers and supported people, which is what this bill is really about. If the intent of this amendment was to require standard actions to be taken resulting from contract breaches, common law already provides long-established remedies for dealing with breaches of contract, which include rights of termination. The procurement rules also include provisions regarding compliance with employment law, and these measures can result in exclusion of bidders who fail to comply. This amendment would add little or nothing to existing law, other than perhaps the obligation to report such a breach and the keeping of a register. This is unlikely to have any greater effect on contractor behaviour than the existing measures already in place, and it would create a further administrative burden with no benefit, despite being a cost to the public purse. So again, I would invite the member not to press the amendment, but if pressed, I would ask the committee not to support it. On Amendment 110, put forward by Carol Mochan, I have sympathy with the intent of the amendment, but I don't believe it's necessary. We have serious concerns that it is out with the legislative competence of the Parliament. Contracted providers already have responsibilities to comply with their legal obligations in relation to employment and labour relations. There are already laws protecting workers' rights to trade union membership and to participate in trade union activities, so provisions to deal with victimisation already exist. However, the Scottish Parliament does not have the competence to extend the scope or intent of labour laws, even when there is cross-party agreement on delivering fair work. So again, I would invite the member not to press the amendment, but if pressed, I would ask the committee not to support it. Whilst we wholeheartedly support the aim of maximising the realisation of human rights for both workers and people accessing care, the proposed Amendment 111 will not do this. Public bodies are already required to respect, protect and fulfil the rights of citizens, including people who work in and use social care services. It introduces measures related to tax avoidance, which raises questions of legislative competence, is out of scope of the bill, and the broad range of regulations to be introduced across the spectrum of human rights placed on ministers is inappropriate and unachievable. The amendment focuses on the profit made and tax practice of care providers. There's already a wealth of legislation regarding legal requirements for tax practices and powers through procurement legislation to exclude providers where they haven't met their tax obligations and have not self-cleansed. This amendment will add no further practical application than is already available. This amendment refers only to social care services. It therefore risks undermining our existing legislation for integrated health and social care, whereas we should be building on and strengthening these. It is therefore my view that the power could not be used in the way that the member may have intended. It risks the delivery of the bill due to questions of legislative competence, and it is therefore neither necessary nor appropriate. So again, I would invite the member not to press the amendment, but if pressed, I would ask the committee not to support Amendment 111. On Amendment 112, put forward by Carol Mochan, I understand what the member wants to achieve. However, at the moment, there are no agreed fair work indicators, and I believe these would need to be agreed with the sector to enable effective and proportionate measurement. The Scottish Government already publishes Fair Work First guidance that public bodies and other public sector partners should give due regard to. Further, given that the burden of any new reporting requirements would fall on the social care sector, especially in local government, health and social care partnerships and social care providers, it would be useful to consult stakeholders on the need for and the impact of this amendment. I'd be happy to work with the member on these issues before stage 3, but for now I would invite the member not to press the amendment. If pressed, I would ask the committee not to support Amendment 112. On Amendment 113, put forward by Carol Mochan, as with Amendment 112, this relies on new data, this time from commissioning authorities on workforce engagement. This means there will be another new burden and cost on the social care sector. But again, I believe I understand what the member wants to achieve as set out for Amendment 112. I would like to consult the sector to understand the impact of this amendment, and I'd be happy to work with the member on this before stage 3. Again, for now, I would invite the member not to press Amendment 113. If pressed, I'd ask the committee not to support it. On Amendment 114 put forward by Jackie Bailey, as I understand, this is an interpretation section to provide clarity on the terms set out in the amendment and used in the new section added by the member. This may well be a useful addition, but at this point we would like to review further following stage 2 on what, if any, interpretation section is required. So again, I would ask the member not to press the amendment. If pressed, I would ask the committee not to support it. On Amendment 146 put forward by Brian Whittle, this amendment seeks to place a duty on Scottish ministers to review ethical commissioning guidelines and to lay a report with the Scottish Parliament once within every 5-year period following royal assent. It's unclear what guidelines are being referred to, and I would welcome clarity from the member. As set out, our intention is for ethical commissioning principles and guidance to support improvement to services so that it's flexible and in response to need and can be reviewed and revised easily over time. Therefore, placing a duty to report on a review of guidelines does seem unduly burdensome and not in keeping with the flexible approach to improvement that is our aim. So I would invite the member not to press the amendment, and if pressed, I would ask the committee not to support it. Amendments 149, 150 and 151. On Amendment 149 put forward by Jackie Bailey and Amendments 150 and 151 put forward by Carol Mochan, the purpose of the amendments 149, 150 and 151 are the same. It's to provide that any regulations under the proposed sections ethical procurement, reportable breaches of contract and fair work indicators are subject to affirmative procedure. These relate to earlier amendments 104, 109 and 112 respectively. I have asked committee members to not support amendments 104, 109 and 112. If those amendments are not agreed, then these amendments should also not be agreed to. I therefore ask the committee to not support amendments 149, 150 and 151.
Thank you, Minister. Jackie Bailey to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 100.
Convener, you'll be pleased to hear I'm not going to cover each of the amendments in turn. I think the committee would have given up the will to live at that point. But let me say a couple of things. Gillian Mackay raised the issue of local authorities. Now, the common principles would be for all social care provision, and it's going to provide the framework for the social care sector. I have an expectation that ministers working alongside their advisory board would use that to inform the strategic plan and to bring that forward. In terms of amendments, I hear what the Minister says. I think certainly in regard to ethical commissioning, I recall discussions with the Minister and others in the sector that ethical commissioning would be on the face of the bill. When we do bring forward amendments, they're rejected, which genuinely is disappointing. In relation to Amendment 104, the Minister referred to statutory guidance. I wonder if that's published or could be shared, because that certainly would be helpful. And in relation to Amendment 106 and other amendments that she referenced, we certainly believe that competence is a matter for the Parliament. Amendments have been accepted. It is a matter for the Parliament to judge, and we believe that those amendments are frankly competent. However, I am conscious there's no other legislative opportunity. I'm really keen that the suite of amendments which builds on the work of the Feely Review and which the Minister has said that she supports, whether it's fair work, human rights or ethical procurement, are actually supported in some way going forward. The amendments actually try and get us to do more than warm words. We're very good in this Parliament and government at doing warm words. We need to put some of these principles on the face of legislation. However, I am a reasonable person, and I'm happy to continue Oh, the Minister's testing my patience by smiling at that. I'm sure she didn't mean to do that. Very reasonable. But I'm happy to continue a discussion if the Minister is willing, because I think there is a shared desire to strengthen the provisions on the bill. So I'm willing to withdraw all of the amendments in order to allow that further dialogue. But if that dialogue is unsuccessful, we of course reserve the right to bring them back at stage 3.
Thank you, Jackie Bailey. So you are withdrawing Amendment 100.
I am indeed, Convener.
Jackie Bailey is withdrawing Amendment 100. Does any member object to the amendment being withdrawn? No one has indicated. So. Thank you. So I call Amendment 100 in the name of 101 in the name of Jackie Bailey. Already debated with Amendment 100. Jackie Bailey to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call on Amendment 102 in the name of Jackie Bailey. Already debated with Amendment 100. Jackie Bailey to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call on Amendment 103 in the name of Jackie Bailey. Already debated with the Amendment 100. Jackie Bailey to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call on Amendment 104 in the name of Jackie Bailey, already debated with Amendment 100. Jackie Bailey to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 105 in the name of Jackie Bailey, already debated with Amendment 100. Jackie Bailey to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 106 in the name of Jackie Bailey, already debated with Amendment 100. Jackie Bailey to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call on Amendment 107 in the name of Carol Mochan, already debated with Amendment 100. Carol Mochan to move or not move?
Given the Minister's comments, I would be happy to work with her, so not moved.
Thank you. I call on Amendment 108 in the name of Carol Mochan, already debated with Amendment 100. Carol Mochan to move or not move?
Not moved.
Call Amendment 109 in the name of Carol Mochan, already debated with Amendment 100. Carol Mochan to move or not move?
Not moved.
Call Amendment 110 in the name of Carol Mochan, already debated with Amendment 100. Carol Mochan to move or not move?
Not moved.
Call Amendment 111 in the name of Carol Mochan, already debated with Amendment 100. Carol Mochan to move or not move?
Not moved.
Call an Amendment 112 in the name of Carol Mochan, already debated with Amendment 100. Carol Mochan to move or not move?
Not moved.
Call Amendment 113 in the name of Carol Mochan, already debated with Amendment 100. Carol Mochan to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 114 in the name of Jackie Bailey, already debated with Amendment 100. Jackie Bailey to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you, and I'm going to briefly suspend the meeting. I call Amendment 115 in the name of Jackie Bailey, grouped with Amendments 126 and 127. Jackie Bailey to move Amendment 115 and to speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Convener, and I would like to move and speak to all three of my amendments in this grouping. If we're going to get social care right in Scotland, I believe we need a national strategy which sets out key objectives that we can all agree on, that identifies the state of the landscape but also respects local structures and accountability. So that's why I've laid down Amendment 115, requiring the Scottish Government to have a 4-year national strategic plan for social care services. That should include social care planning and procurement of services, and as you can see from the amendment, this strategy would be comprehensive, designed in consultation and collaboration with key stakeholders across the sector. And it would drive the consensus about what needs to be done for social care to be the very best that it can be. Amendment 126 requires the Scottish Government, IJBs and HSCPs to publish details of funding available for social care within the current financial year and for the subsequent 5 financial years. This information would be published at least once every financial year, and similarly, Amendment 127 calls for the data collection and reporting of social care needs, including unmet need and the estimated costs. I think it's important that we have transparency about finances and that we have an understanding of the level of unmet need across Scotland. And it serves as an opportunity to assess the progress that ministers are making. If we are to get serious about transforming social care and ensuring it is meeting the needs of our population, then we need a clear strategic approach agreed on by stakeholders. So I urge all members to support these amendments in Group 5, and I move Amendment 115.
Minister.
Thank you, Convener. I can't support Jackie Bailey's Amendment 115 at this time, but I'd be very happy to work with the member on alternative wording to consider for Stage 3. I agree that it would be very helpful for us to have a strategic plan for health and social care services. However, the problem with Amendment 115 is that it could lead to a situation where ministers would have to take on responsibility for delivery of social care services if all other routes fail. That would go against the agreement that local government should retain statutory responsibility for delivery of social work and social care services and employment of staff and ownership of the assets. I don't think that's the intention for this amendment, and I'd be more than happy to work with the Committee on Alternative Wording around a requirement for a national strategy for health and social care if that was wanted in the legislation. Although I must stress that we do not now need legislation to have such a strategy. In doing so, I'd want to make sure that we strengthen and build on the integration of health and social care. Turning now to Jackie Bailey's Amendment 126, the Scottish Government's committed to improving financial transparency of Integration Authority spending, including on social care. The powers to specify financial reporting by Integration Joint Boards already exist under the Public Bodies Joint Working Scotland Act 2014 and are sufficient for this purpose. The total funding available for social care within a financial year is subject to changes within each year, so that an accurate report of the amounts available can't be made until after the end of each financial year. For the same reason, accurate long-term forecasts are not possible. Any published information of the nature required by the proposed amendment would therefore be subject to frequent revision and place considerable burden on the reporting bodies and erode public confidence in the information. So I can't support Amendment 126, and I invite members not to support that amendment. I do welcome the intention of Jackie Bailey's Amendment 127. Understanding and costing current and future need for social care is valuable for informing policy development, strategic planning, monitoring and evaluation. However, there are significant limitations with existing data which would make reporting against them meaningless. In addition, this would also create a duplication, as integration authorities are required in legislation to produce a local needs assessment. With cognizance of the complexities and challenges with data availability, The Scottish Government is already progressing work to better understand social care needs based on existing data and with an aim to inform future approaches to data collection and reporting. However, I am open to working with the member at stage 3 to consider how we could address these data gaps. I invite the member not to press the amendment, but if pressed, I would ask the committee not to support Amendment 127.
Thank you, Minister. Jackie Bailey to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 115.
Thank you very much, Convener. There is currently no effective strategy, hence, in my view, the need for an amendment. There is lack of transparency, I have to say, Minister, amongst some of the social care bodies, and trying to get information from them is like trying to get blood from a stone, and we absolutely need to improve data and reporting, otherwise how will we be able to measure progress? However, I will be consistently reasonable. I know the Minister will be pleased to hear that. I will agree to withdraw the 3 amendments on the understanding that she will work with me prior to stage 3 to bring something back.
Thank you, Ms Bailey. So Jackie Bailey wishes to withdraw Amendment 115. Does any member object to the amendment being withdrawn? No. Thank you. Call Amendment 116 in the name of Brian Whittle, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. Brian Whittle to move Amendment 116 and to speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. Moving 116, again looking at the Stage 1 report that the committee recommended, and that a single electronic health and care record is fundamental to the success of the purpose of the National Care Service, and it called on the Scottish Government to complete this as a matter of urgency. I'm looking for this to be done by 2027, because in 2018 the Scottish Government produced Scotland's Digital Health and Care Strategy, which drew upon the Health and Sport Committee report on technology and innovation in health and social care, where the committee agreed that a data sharing through a single platform that connects with other systems as the best way forward. And I quote, we recommend any cross-cutting technology, if it is to effectively join up health and social care, must include the social and community care sector and hospices, and would expect to see this in the strategy. The Scottish Government hasn't actually delivered on a rolling delivery plan targets. We are now 7 years on and still discussing the importance of healthcare technology integration rather than simply delivering it. And Amendment 122 in particular seeks to address concerns around data breaches by requiring ministers to report on the cost of such breaches and what steps they will take to prevent further breaches. And I think this clause will help the government self-reflect and improve security. I think what we are talking here is the ability for social care to speak to primary care, to speak to secondary care. I think to me that is, for this bill to have any kind of success, is absolutely fundamental, and we are way behind the curve, and I think we should be putting those kind of targets finally against the government. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister to speak to Amendment 42 and other amendments in the group.
I ask the committee not to support Amendments 116, 117, 118, 119, 120, 121, 122, 124, and to support the amendments in my name, which are Amendments 42, 43 and 44. Brian Whittle's Amendment 116 seeks to mandate regulations for an information sharing scheme as part of Section 36, and I appreciate the intention behind that. As the regulations are subject to the affirmative procedure, parliamentary approval of draft regulations would be required. If ministers are under a duty rather than having a power, the duty would require ministers to keep returning to Parliament until it was content to approve a draft instrument. In some cases, it is clear that a duty is required, but ministers will bring forward regulations to set out details of the scheme under this provision in any event. In the circumstances, I do not consider anything more than a power is needed. The spirit and intention of Section 36 is to create this scheme based on the need for reform in health and social care as identified in the Independent Review of Adult Social Care. And our intention on this was clearly set out in the accompanying documents on bill introduction. I therefore invite members of the committee not to support Amendment 116. On Amendment 117 put forward by Brian Whittle, the mandated creation of a single digital platform is not necessary to achieve the objective of better information sharing. An appropriate legal gateway, along with interoperable systems underpinned by common information standards, achieves the same intent. The creation of a single digital platform creates potential issues for health and social care organisations who do not have the right infrastructure or funds to implement a digital system. It also represents a significant risk in respect of so-called vendor lock-in, which would create unacceptable financial and resilience risks. Again, I invite members of the committee not to support Amendment 1117. My own amendments 42, 43 and 44 identify the scope of the information sharing provision. They simplify the scope by setting out what public health and social care services will be encompassed without reference to organisational structures. I ask the committee to support my amendments. On Amendment 118, brought forward by Gillian Mackay, I understand the intention in seeking to expand the scope of Section 36, and that's what I aim to achieve in my own amendments 42, 43 and 44. Without a definition of care services in legislation, it would be difficult to interpret and accurately assess the effect of Amendment 118. I therefore encourage members of the committee not to support Amendment 118. The spirit of the amendment suggested by Gillian Mackay's Amendment 119 is something that I recognise. However, the true effect in legislation means I can't support this. Existing legislation referred to the UK Government sets out an individual's rights to how their information is processed and provides for accessibility. As Amendment 119 is about the control of information, we consider it relates to the reserved matter of data protection, and that it would therefore be out with the competence of the Parliament. Although I agree that individuals should have a say in who accesses information in their records, it wouldn't be practical to promise that they could exercise full control over this. Indeed, it wouldn't be in the public interest. By way of an example, it's important that health and care professionals are able to access records without explicit consent when providing emergency care. So again, I would invite the member not to press the amendment, but if pressed, I would ask the committee not to support it. Turning now to Jackie Bailey's Amendment 120, I understand the motivation behind legislating for a digital shared care record, but I do not agree with the proposal. Amendment 120 relates to the control of information, which I consider to be a reserved matter of data protection. It would therefore be out with the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament. I therefore again would invite the member not to press the amendment, but if pressed, would ask the committee not to support it. On Amendment 121 by Sandesh Golhani, I can't support this amendment as it's currently drafted, as paragraph B of the amendment is unclear as to its scope and intent. Specifically, it is unclear if it relates to the portability of assessments or simply that services in a particular local authority should be able to access information created and/or held by other local authorities. Although I can't support this amendment, I do wish to assure the member that digital access to personal health and care information for members of the public is a priority and something we are actively pursuing. Parliament will be aware that recently the First Minister announced that the first release of our digital front door will be available in Lanarkshire from December this year. The first release will include the ability for people to access part of their core health information, and over time more and more health and care information about an individual will be fully accessible to them via digital means. So again, I would invite members not to support Amendment 121. On Brian Whittle's Amendment 122, I fully recognise the importance of accountability and transparency, particularly in matters involving the sensitive personal information of citizens. However, I would resist this amendment on the grounds that information breaches are likely to arise from being in breach with other relevant data protection legislation, rather than the scheme provided. I do not believe it's possible to accurately assess the financial costs associated with information breaches. With regards to setting the Scottish Government's approach to setting out plans to prevent future information breaches, I would direct Brian Whittle to our data strategy for health and social care. In addition to this, I believe that existing arrangements to hold ministers to account, such as parliamentary questions, would be suitable for the member to receive updates on a regular basis. So again, I would ask the member not to press the amendment, but if pressed, I would invite the committee not to support it. On Amendment 124, I realise Brian Whittle's motivation behind legislating for a single electronic health and care record, but do not agree with the proposal and urge the committee not to support this amendment. Firstly, Section 36 is not about the creation of one such record, it's about creating the legal gateway by which a range of reforms to information sharing within health and social care can be brought forward. Secondly, a single record offers a significantly less attractive proposition than that of an integrated record, specifically as this allows for flexibility of the procurement of digital systems to meet the needs of local organisations and mitigates a multitude of risks. The challenges posed by creating a single record, in particular in relation to fiscal and technical design considerations, would be prohibiting factors in mandating for this within the timeframe.
Thank you, Minister. Gillian Mackay to speak to Amendment 118 and other amendments in the group.
Thanks, Convener. Section 36 of the bill outlines information sharing requirements for professionals working within public health and social care services. In order to create a care record system that is person-centred, this section of the legislation should be amended to outline measures to ensure citizen control of and access to their data and a digital choice approach. My two amendments seek to ensure that the care records established under this bill align with best practices in human rights data approaches and a digital choice framework. By embedding clear rights into the regulations, this amendment strengthens personal autonomy and ensures that individuals have meaningful control over their care information. The amendment provides that citizens must have the right of access to and control their own care records, including the ability to determine who can access different types of information. And this is essential for maintaining privacy and trust in the system. I recognise what the Minister has said around the control and some people potentially being excluded. If this needs worked on, I'm happy to do so if further definition would be useful. But there are people out with the normal people who would have data shared around doctors and things like that that people might not necessarily want their data shared with, and I think that that choice is essential. Additionally, it ensures that guardians can exercise these rights on behalf of those for whom they hold legal responsibility, offering clarity and protection for vulnerable individuals. Crucially, the amendment also guarantees that care records will be accessible in various formats, ensuring that no one is excluded due to digital barriers. The amendments make it explicit that providers of care services should be included in the information sharing framework, and again I take on the point from the Minister about that definition of care providers. But care providers need appropriate access to relevant records to deliver safe, effective and person-centred care. And I should say that these were worked on with third sector care providers who obviously don't always have access to all of the records that they feel that they need. However, this must be balanced with strong safeguards that give individuals control over their own data by ensuring a clear, rights-based approach to information governance, and these amendments support a more transparent, accessible and accountable system. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Gillian Mackay. Jackie Bailey to speak to Amendment 120 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Convener. Despite repeated government commitments for greater integration of health and social care, it's clear that talking to those on the coalface that this has simply not happened. One of the most obvious examples is the collection and sharing of a patient's information to trusted bodies involved in an individual's care. And despite digital solutions existing, the government has been much too slow to take action and seems to be stuck in an analogue age. So in lodging this amendment, I want the use of digital technology to improve data sharing. Now, despite the government's track record, I remain an optimist, which is why I lodged Amendment 120, requiring the creation of that digital shared record, setting out practical examples of what this should include, with safeguards around the sharing of information and data protection. The detail will, of course, be for government to bring forward in regulations. We don't believe that this amendment is reserved. But if the Minister is willing to discuss this, I would, of course, consider withdrawing it. And for the record, we support all the other amendments in this group. Thank you, Convener.
Bailey Sanders Gohani to speak to Amendment 121 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. Data. The data is not ours. The data is not the NHS's. The data that is held belongs to the individual, the patient, the person. And it is important that full access to this data is available to the individual, the patient. And I think it is very important we don't lose sight of this and that we look to do as much as we can to provide that reassurance. The Minister spoke of Gillian Mackay's 119118 and said that that might hinder emergency care. But it is quite clear that when you are participating within a scheme, you would be told that that full data would be accessible in cases of emergency, in cases of going to see your GP, as that is absolutely vital. And yet, I don't think that necessarily the care worker that comes to your door to help you needs to see your full care records or your health records, and that would be something that the individual could choose what that person would see or not. I am, and we are in full support of all amendments within this group. And the Minister spoke of how Brian Whittle's amendment doesn't require a single platform and it not being necessary. When you are on the front line, when you are seeing patients, when I am unable as a GP to see what the hospital has said a month later, I cannot tell you how important that single data platform is. When I was working psychiatry, I was unable to see what the patient's notes or write in the patient's notes when I was cross-covering paediatric psychiatry. This is not safe and this is not acceptable when we're in 2025. It's simply not a position we should be in. And very lastly, the Minister spoke of my amendment. The amendment really is looking at portability and allowing an individual to move with their data and local authorities being able to see it. But I don't think it would be the worst thing, if allowed, for local authorities to be able to see anyone's data as long as they were given permission to do so by the individual.
Thank you, Sanj Gohani. Brian Whittle to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 116.
Thank you, Convener. I think it's with a degree of frustration I listened to the Cabinet Secretary, where she contradicts Scottish Government's intention and also contradicts what our own Cabinet Secretary says. And I'm just listening to Sandesh Gohani speaking there from a perspective of a healthcare professional, how unbelievably important it is to have this kind of platform. And I repeat, in 2018, the Scottish Government produced Scotland's Digital Health and Care Strategy, and it drew upon the Health and Sport Committee's report on technology and innovation in healthcare and social care, where the committee agreed that a data sharing through a single platform that connects the other systems is the best way forward. I'll take an intervention from my colleague.
Thanks, Convener. Thank you, Mr Whittle, for taking an intervention. So I'm thinking about, as a healthcare professional myself and in working in acute care as well as out in the community teaching nurses in the past, there has been challenges, and we've heard it over recent times in evidence that we've taken regarding digital access and access to your case notes and everything. So, but I'm interested in, wouldn't it be better to employ a digital strategy in a whole separate thing? Because we are talking about primary care, secondary care, care in the community now, so that there is a, and with the evolution of artificial intelligence, wouldn't we be better looking at that separately than inserting it into this bill?
No, I don't think so. I think the reason why is everything's connected. All of healthcare should be connected. Healthcare professionals should be seamless. How we move care from one sector, one part of the NHS into care, into primary, into secondary, even into, in some cases, the third sector. And the fact of the matter is, as I've said many times, this country is way behind the rest of the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom is way behind much of the rest of Europe. And the longer we leave this, the harder the solution is going to be. And I think it's incumbent upon this Parliament to set, to send that message to the government and to set a target. And I know that the Cabinet Secretary actually agrees with that. So I think what we need is a general platform that allows autonomy across the whole sector to deploy different kinds of software. But it's incredibly important, especially in an acute setting, that you're able to access, whether that be pharmacology, whether that be whatever has come out of primary secondary care. If somebody's coming out of hospital, it is so important that everybody understands that they're delivering that care, what other care has been given. So I find it very frustrating, Convener, when I listen to the Cabinet Secretary say this, because there's so many mixed messages coming out of the government and we're not making any progress here. So I would urge the committee to pass my amendments, because it's just fundamentally important. If anything's going to come out of this bill, it's fundamentally important that we have that one platform. And I would move my amendment, Convener.
Thank you, Mr Bristol. I think you might have promoted the Minister there to Cabinet Secretary level. But so the question is that Amendment 116 be agreed to. Are we agreed? No. Committee's not in agreement. We'll have a division. Those in favour of Amendment 116, please indicate. Those against? Any abstentions? Vote for Amendment 116. There were 5 members voted for. There were 5 members voted against. As there is a tie, I must exercise a casting vote, and my casting vote is to vote against the amendment. Therefore, the amendment is not agreed. I call Amendment 117. Yep, in relation, in the name of Brian Whittle, already debated with Amendment 116. Brian Whittle, to move or not move?
Moved, please.
The question is that Amendment 117 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. Committee's not agreed, therefore there'll be a division. Members in favour of Amendment 117, can they please indicate? Those against? Any abstentions? There were 5 votes for Amendment 117 and 5 votes against. As there is a tie, I must exercise a casting vote, and my casting vote is against the amendment. Therefore, the amendment is not agreed. I call Amendment 42 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 116. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 42 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Committee is agreed. I call Amendment 43 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 116. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 43 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I call Amendment 118 in the name of Gillian Mackay, already debated with Amendment 116. Gillian Mackay, to move or not move?
Given the work that's needed on the definition, not moved, with a view to bring it back at stage 3.
Thank you. I call Amendment 119 in the name of Gillian Mackay, already debated with Amendment 116. Gillian Mackay, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 119 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Committee's not agreed, therefore there will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 119, please indicate. Those against? Any abstentions? The vote on Amendment 119, there were 5 members voted for, 5 members voted against. Therefore, as there is a tie, I must exercise a casting vote. My casting vote is to vote against the amendment. Therefore, the amendment is disagreed to. I call Amendment 120 in the name of Jackie Bailey, already debated with Amendment 116. Jackie Bailey, to move or not move?
I think the Minister gave an indication that she'd prepared to discuss it before stage 3, and if that's the case, then I'm happy to withdraw.
Thank you, Ms Bailey. It's not moved rather than withdrawing.
Sorry, not moved.
Thank you. I call Amendment 121 in the name of Sandesh Gohani, already debated with Amendment 116. Sandesh Gohani, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 121 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Committee's not agreed, therefore there will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 121, can they please indicate? Those against? And abstentions? Thank you. 5 members voted in favour of Amendment 121 and 5 against. As there is a tie, I must exercise a casting vote, and my casting vote is to vote against the amendment. Therefore, the amendment is disagreed to. I call Amendment 122 in the name of Brian Whittle, already debated with Amendment 116. Brian Whittle, to move or not move?
Moves, Convener.
Thank you, Mr Whittle. The question is that Amendment 122 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Committee's not agreed, therefore there will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 122, can they please indicate? Those against? Any abstentions? Five members voted in favour of Amendment 122 and 5 members voted against. As there is a tie, I must exercise a casting vote, and my casting vote is to vote against the amendment. Therefore, the amendment is disagreed to. Call Amendment 44 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 116. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 44 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Thank you. I call Amendment 121 in the name of Brian Whittle.
123.
Oh, sorry, 123. In the name of Brian Whittle, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. Brian Whittle, to move Amendment 123 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Formally move, Convener. Once again, I give the opportunity to members to, in these leave-out amendments, to accept that this isn't the right approach and to try again to develop the very best legislation in which this sector needs. This bill is now exactly the same as it always was, apart from changing virtually every section in it. And if we pass this bill in the way it is, there's going to be the need further down the line to bolt on other legislation, and that never works. I think once again the Scottish Government are failing to recognise when they've become victims of a sunk cost fallacy, and they're convincing themselves that no matter how bad the path they're on is, they've spent so much time and effort to get here, it is unthinkable to turn back. And I think my concern here is we're not going to do the justice to the people that this is trying to help. We will not reform care and will not protect those it proclaims to support in the manner it could and it should. From the very origins of the NCS Bill, the Scottish Government have been desperate to stress how much engagement they have done with stakeholders ahead of the first draft of the bill. Even when the number of stakeholders against the plan rose well beyond those who supported it, they persisted, and yet they provide amendments for Stage 2 less than 48 hours before the deadline to lodge amendments, giving MSPs and stakeholders alike virtually no time to review or comment on the changes, never mind propose improvements. And having spoken to senior figures within the care sector, I know just how much of a disappointment this has been. Apparently, stakeholder feedback is not a priority when it aligns with the Scottish Government. Even this committee's own report on the bill recommended that stakeholders have a formal opportunity to consult on Stage 2. But I suppose since the Scottish Government have rendered at least 100 pages of the document irrelevant with the scrapping of Part 1, they saw little reason to heed the rest. However, members may wish to view my intentions of my amendments to raise the rest of this shadow of bill. I want to be clear that I do recognise that social care needs serious reform. I want people across Scotland, many of them very vulnerable, to have swift and equal access to effective care. But I also see the consequences if we get these early steps towards that wrong. As I've said, it's my firm belief that the best approach is to start again, and I hope colleagues will agree with me. Now, while I am proposing to remove all sections of the bill, I would urge colleagues to give particular consideration to my Amendment 139, which is leaving out section 41. Not only is this yet another section where the attention of the Scottish Government is unclear, but I and others, including stakeholders within the care sector, believe this could be interpreted as a means of excluding any profit-making entity from providing care services. I would, of course, welcome a clarification from the Minister on this point. The mere fact that they appear willing to allow an amendment that interpretation to come forward troubles me greatly. I think it's incompatible with ethical commissioning and procurement and the relevant recommendations of the Scottish Parliament Health, Social Care and Sports Committee. I think it's incompatible with the Social Care Self-Directed Support Scotland Act 2013. I think it's incompatible with the need for a sustainable mixed market. It's incompatible with pre-existing Scottish Government guidance on procuring of care and support services. It lacks evidence support of reserve procurement across public consultation and significant shortcomings to the Scottish Government BRIA for the NHS Bill. Convener.
Mr Whittle. Minister.
These amendments brought forward by Brian Whittle would remove sections 36 to 48 of the bill as introduced. This would, in effect, remove the remaining sections of the bill following my amendments to remove Part 1 of the bill. I ask committee members not to support these amendments. Brian Whittle's amendments 123 and 125 to section 36 and 37 would result in barriers to the effective sharing of information and the consistent use of information standards across health and social care. This would negatively impact our ability to improve the delivery of high-quality health and care services for individuals. Brian Whittle's Amendment 134 and 135 propose removing the introduction of rights to breaks for unpaid carers. Establishing this right is one which has received an overwhelmingly positive response. It is clear that there is support for delivering this right, which will help ensure unpaid carers can have a life alongside their caring role and is likely to reduce other costs through unplanned hospital admissions, failed hospital discharge and additional residential care when caring relationships break down. I remain committed to delivering this crucial right to breaks, to uphold the health and well-being of unpaid carers and to publicly recognise the immense value of the support they provide. Brian Whittle's Amendment 138 removes provisions related to Anne's Law. We are absolutely committed to delivering Anne's Law, for which there is strong cross-party support. Our Amendment 50 includes provision for enabling care home residents to identify an essential care supporter as called for by Care Home Relatives Scotland. I am grateful to the Relatives Group and others for working with us to bring forward our amendment. Brian Whittle's Amendment 139 removes section 41, which extends the reserved contracting process to third sector organisations in health and social care. This process helps these organisations compete with larger for-profit ones. It supports a flexible, mixed market model for delivering social care with decisions made locally based on local needs. The independent and third sector, both profit and not-for-profit, are and will continue to be important partners in delivering social care for Scotland. The acceptance of Brian Whittle's amendments would halt reform in a range of really important areas, which I believe largely command cross-party support. I cannot believe that the member would want us to halt Anne's Law and the right to breaks for carers. I therefore ask the committee to not support all of the amendments in this group.
Sandesh Gohani has asked to speak, and after he's spoken, I will bring you back, Minister, if you wish to respond to his points. Sandesh Gohani.
Thank you, Convener. The Minister speaks of hers and the Government's commitment to Anne's Law. Where was this commitment 3.5 years ago, when this could have been brought in and sailed through Parliament? Where was the Minister's commitment to the right to break for carers 3.5 years ago? These are amendments that the Minister has put in, and quite simply, this has been done on the back of a failed NCS bill, instead of it being front and centre in the original, or front and centre on its own, standing on its own, and it again would sail through because it commands the full support of Parliament. This is not the way to do it.
Minister.
And I do not agree with Sandesh Gohani's narrative on these points. The reason for putting Anne's Law in particular into this piece of legislation is because this piece of legislation is absolutely embedded in human rights, and it is an appropriate place to put Anne's Law, which is also about embedding human rights in our social care system. Anne's Law has proved difficult in terms of the balancing of ECHR rights. I don't agree that it could have been done 3.5 years ago. You can see around the UK and across in Ireland that nobody has legislated yet for similar. We are leading the way in this, and I look forward to gaining the support of committee members in ensuring that Anne's Law passes within this bill.
Jackie Bailey has indicated that she also wishes to speak on this, and again, Minister, I'll bring you back to answer.
Just a very tiny contribution, because I have sympathy with Brian Whittle's frustrations, although I don't believe the committee should support his amendments. It is the case that rights to break for carers, Anne's Law, could have been done much sooner, and I hesitate to point out that the Minister has already rejected amendments about embedding human rights in this bill. I hope, of course, to work with her, but I do recognise Brian Whittle's frustrations, although I wouldn't advocate support for his amendments. Thank you, Convener.
Minister, have you anything further to add?
Many thanks. I'm glad to hear that Jackie Bailey and I presume Labour Party members' support for the legislation that is proposed extends to voting for it and against wrecking amendments.
Thank you, Minister. Brian Whittle to wind up and Presser withdraw Amendment 123.
Thank you, Convener. I think specifically on 139, I think the problem is one of ambiguity and what could come out the back of it. I think if we looked at, when I talked about the incompatibility with ethical commissioning and procurement and relevant recommendations of the Scottish Parliament Health and Social Care and Sport Committee, if you look at that in paragraph 89, it says there is an inherent contradiction between reserving the right to participate in procurement by type of organisation and the principles of ethical commissioning. So I think it's really important that I understand what the Minister is trying to do in terms of with this part of the bill. I think we have to remove the ambiguity and what the potential is out the back of that. I have to say that again, this trying to tag this bill around Anne's Law and unpaid carers, I find quite disturbing, because we all support Anne's Law 100%. We all support the need for unpaid carers to have a break. But trying to force this bill through on the back of that, I find quite frankly disgraceful. I think if the public knew the way in which sometimes this legislation is done, I think they would be up in arms, because this, as my colleagues have said, this Anne's Law, unpaid carers breaks, could have been done in secondary legislation 3.5 years ago. There's no need for this bill. And the reason I'm asking for the bill to start again is because I do not believe the bill as it's currently drafted will do what it could and should do for those it pertains to support. I move the amendment, Convener.
Thank you, Mr Whittle. The question is that Amendment 123 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. The committee is not agreed, therefore have a division. Those members in favour of Amendment 123, can they please indicate? Those against? Any abstentions? Thank you. 2 members voted for Amendment 123, 8 members voted against, therefore the amendment is not agreed to. The question is that Section 36 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. I call Amendment 124 in the name of Brian Whittle, already debated, with Amendment 116. Brian Whittle, to move or not move? The question is that Amendment 124 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Committee is not agreed, therefore there will be a division. Can members in favour of Amendment 124 please indicate? Those against? Abstentions? Five members voted for Amendment 124, 5 members voted against Amendment 124. There were no abstentions. This is a tie. I must exercise a casting vote, and my casting vote is to vote against the amendment, and the amendment is disagreed to. I call Amendment 45 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendments 46, 47, 48, 49 and 64. Minister to move Amendment 45 and to speak to all amendments in the group, please.
My amendments 45 and 48 clarify what can be considered to be an information standard and allow standards to be set by reference to documents that do not yet exist. They also provide for details around the duty to make the standards publicly available and separately withdrawing them, so Scotland may keep in with the dynamic movement of the standards landscape. My Amendment 46 and 47 recognise amendments proposed to Part 1 of the Bill and update the chapter on information standards accordingly, whilst also adding the power by regulation for Scottish ministers to modify the people and organisations to whom Section 37 applies. It also allows for civil sanctions, for a civil sanctions regime to be introduced where breaches are incurred. My Amendment 49 provides definitions for this new chapter on information standards. My Amendment 64 is a technical amendment to apply the affirmative procedure to regulation-making powers in Amendments 46 and 47. I urge members to support my Amendments 45, 46, 47, 48, 49 and 64.
Thank you, Minister. No member has indicated they wish to speak on this group of amendments. Is there anything further that you wish to add? No. Can you wind up, please?
No, I'm content.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 45 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 125 in the name of Brian Whittle, already debated, with Amendment 123. Brian Whittle, to move or not move?
I think, given the likely outcome, I'll save the committee the time. Disappointingly, I will withdraw the amendment.
Thank you. So you're not moving?
I'm not moving.
Not moving. Thank you. The question is that Section 37 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I call Amendments 46, 47, 48 and 49, all in the name of the Minister and all previously debated, with Amendment 45. I invite the Minister to move the Amendments 46 to 49 en bloc. Does any member object to a single question being put on the amendments? Can the Minister please move those amendments on block?
Moved on block.
Thank you very much. I call amendment one.
You need to ask if any member objects to the on block.
I did.
Okay.
Call amendment 126 in the name of Jackie Bailey, already debated, with amendment 115. Jackie Bailey to move or not move?
Not move, convener.
Sorry, Convener, can we just stop for a second?
Yep. Question is that amendments 46 to 49 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Apologies. So I call amendment 127 in the name of Jackie Bailey. I did 126 and Jackie Bailey didn't move. I call amendment 127 in the name of Jackie Bailey, already debated, with amendment 115. Jackie Bailey to move or not move?
Not move, convener.
Thank you. Here. Yeah. I call amendment 128 in the name of Sanders Gohani, grouped with amendments 129, 130, 152 and 153. Sanders Gohani to move amendment 128 and to speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. I move my amendment. It is very important that we look at what the situation is like right now across our country. And it is clear that local authorities up and down our country are slashing care for people who need it. It is quite clear that across our country that people who are desperately in need of care, when they want to leave hospital, when they want to be within their own home, when their care needs change, are not receiving the urgent care that they need. And Amendment 128 would look to ensure that we are able to give people a reassuring timeline. Obviously, 6 weeks is a very long time, and we wouldn't want it to be that long, but at least there is a timeline that they have to get their care. And I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to be asking for. For Amendments 129 and 130, we would agree with Paul Sweeney and would be very keen to see these in the bill as well.
Thank you. Sanders Gohani, Paul Sweeney to speak to Amendment 129 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener and members of the committee. My amendment number 129 requires Scottish ministers to provide regulations that expedite access to social care services for those with terminal illness and increasing levels of social care services to the progression of the terminal illness. Committee, we all know of cases where those who have had terminal illnesses have had to wait for social care services for the majority of their remaining days. This amendment gets rid of this national scandal by guaranteeing that their terminal illness is considered when social care services are also being considered. On Amendment 130, it requires Scottish ministers to create regulations that provide an individual with the same equivalent care when they move from one local authority to the other, thus preventing the all too frequent situation where an individual with a care package loses their entitlement if they move between local authority areas. Amendment 152 confirms that regulations relating to the section on terminal illness provision of services are subject to the affirmative procedure of section 46. And Amendment 153 confirms that regulations relating to the section portable care packages are subject to the affirmative procedure of section 46.
Thank you, Mr Sweeney. Minister.
Thank you, Convener. I ask the committee to resist all amendments in this group. On Amendment 128, local authorities have a duty under the Self-Directed Support Act 2013 to provide social care through self-directed support with people who are eligible for social care being offered a range of choices over how they receive their support. Consideration and delivery of care is as a result of collaborative discussion which may not be compatible with the timescale. The provision of social care and timelines for delivery are also the responsibility of the local authority. The assessment of needs is for the local authority and there is no statutory definition of critical need. The result would be ambiguity and uncertainty. I therefore resist this amendment. Given that Amendment 129 as drafted could interfere with the current powers under the Social Work Scotland Act 1968, this amendment is not supported. The purpose of Amendment 152 is to add corresponding provisions for regulations for Amendment 129 into Section 46, so I do not support this either. However, I am keen to work with the member at Stage 3 to consider how we could take this forward. On 130 and 153, I understand the intention of these amendments. The point of need should absolutely be consistent and transferable across Scotland as already stipulated in legislation. However, as local government do have the statutory right to implement their own policies in relation to eligibility and assessment and have a duty of care to those within their jurisdiction, it would not be feasible to provide care without completing suitable assessments or evaluations of needs. It is for that purpose that I resist these amendments. I therefore ask the committee to resist all amendments in this group.
Thank you, Minister. Sandish Gohani, to wind up, press or withdraw Amendment 128.
Thank you. I hear the Minister speak of people being allowed self-directed support with a collaborative discussion. Collaborative discussion by being told you can employ somebody and take on all the difficulties that come with employing somebody. That is your choice and that is up to you. And here is some money to do that. Good luck. That is not collaborative. That is not allowing self-directed support to be done in an appropriate way. We are leaving people who require care to simply fend for themselves if that is the case. And we have heard that time and time and time again from people who with lived experience. The Minister speaks a lot about ensuring that there is lived experience and that she does speak to people with lived experience, and yet this doesn't seem to have been picked up. I do find it concerning. I think it's quite clear that 6 weeks does seem to be a decent amount of time for people to be able to give care, and I think we can go on to define critical need in secondary legislation as required. As far as Paul Sweeney and his amendments, I do think that when somebody has a terminal illness, we should do everything we can to ensure that they are looked after as quickly as possible. And so that is why I would support Paul Sweeney's amendments, and I move the amendment.
Thank you, Sandish Gohani. The question is that Amendment 128 be agreed. Are we agreed? No. Committee is not agreed, so there will be a division. Members in favour of Amendment 128, can you please indicate? Those against? Abstentions? Two members voted in favour of Amendment 128, 5 voted against and 3 members abstained on the vote, and therefore the amendment is not agreed to. I call Amendment 129 in the name of Paul Sweeney, already debated with Amendment 128. Paul Sweeney, to move or not move?
Though the Minister has indicated perhaps interest in discussion, I do feel this is a critical matter and it does merit being moved.
Thank you, Mr Sweeney. The question is that Amendment 129 be agreed to. Are we agreed? No. Committee is not agreed. There will be a division. Those members in favour of Amendment 129, can you please indicate? Those against? Abstentions? 5 members voted in favour of Amendment 129. 5 members voted against. There were no abstentions. As there's a tie, I must exercise a casting vote, and my casting vote is against the amendment. Therefore, the amendment is not agreed. I call Amendment 130 in the name of Paul Sweeney, already debated with Amendment 128. Paul Sweeney, to move or not move?
Moved, Convener.
The question is that Amendment 130 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Committee is not agreed, therefore there will be a division. And those members who wish to vote for Amendment 130, please indicate. Those against? Abstentions? Four members of the committee voted in favour of Amendment 130, 5 against, and there was 1 abstention. Therefore, the amendment is disagreed to. As we have reached a natural break in proceedings, and we are not going to conclude stage 2 today, I am going to call a halt to the meeting, and at our next meeting next week we'll continue our stage 2 considerations of the National Care Service Scotland Bill, and that concludes our meeting today.